This is Frankie Lynch, astrological consultant. Please like and subscribe. I need all the help I can get. And visit me at frankielynch.com. I do wonderful readings. You can email me at frankielynch777@gmail.com to book an appointment. So anyway, I wanted to talk a bit today about Saturn going into Pisces. Saturn enters Pisces on March 7th. So what can we expect with this upcoming transit? Well, I was looking in the past, because that's what I do. I love history. And so I was looking at the last 3 times that Saturn went through Pisces. It was in the 1930s, the 1960s, the 1990s, and now the 2020s. Each time we've seen this theme arise, I was contemplating how to summarize Saturn in Pisces archetypally. What came to me was facing hard truths. I was thinking about this video game I used to play when I was in high school. It was called Silent Hill 2. I'm not going to belabor the whole thing, but it was a pretty scary game. It's a very psychological game too. The concept is that, spoiler alert, but that the protagonist, James Sunderland, had killed his wife after she had been sick for a very, very long time. Then he goes to this mysterious town that engulfs him in a world of nightmares that were really just reflections of his own torment and trauma as he seeks redemption for what he did. He has to wade through a nightmarish world, encountering all sorts of fantastic creatures and monsters. And as he gets to the end, or closer to the end, he starts to get more clarity. And so this is what I think about with Saturn and Pisces. It's a very dual thing. Because on the one hand, we have this nightmare. Yeah? We have the fantasy or the fog. The fog was a symbol in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. Another wonderful book that to me sort of summarizes Saturn and Pisces. One of the main characters imagines, right, as the fog comes over him, everyone just taken like cattle on meat hooks and siphoned down through this labyrinth of mechanical gears and machines, just taking them apart. The fog is about lack of clarity. It's about escaping from reality. Interestingly enough, in Silent Hill 2, the whole scene is engulfed in this fog. Again, emblematic of this lack of clarity. So why did this all come to me besides being into horror games as a kid? Well, because Saturn is the Lord of deception. We often think of Neptune as deception, don't we? But before there was Neptune, there was Saturn. Before there was Uranus, there was Saturn. Before there was Pluto, there was Saturn. All the outer planets imported their meanings, or sort of appropriated them, right, from my dear Saturn. My daddy. Anyway, Saturn and Pisces. On the one hand, we have the Lord of Deception, moving through a sign of idealism. Pisces is ruled by Jupiter. In the cycle of a year, it was rising up towards Aries. It was rising towards that point where darkness no longer dominated, and the light sprang forth. It was equal night and equal day in Aries, the vernal equinox. But there's something very optimistic and idealistic about Pisces aspiring to that point, or looking towards that point. So when Saturn's coming through here, the Lord of Deception, through this imaginative Pisces energy, we can see the fog roll in, the miasmas, the things that we get entranced by and entrapped in. So facing hard truths is what came to me. And how do we face hard truths? By processing our own experiences and our own traumas. So to me, that's sort of a theme of Saturn going through Pisces. Now, what sort of events correlate with this transit? Well, let's look at a couple. The last time Saturn went into Pisces was May of 1993. What's interesting to note is the transition between Saturn in Aquarius and Saturn in Pisces. Saturn in Aquarius seems to bring oppositions to established power. Capricorn, on the one hand, with its ruler Saturn, represent established power. Then Aquarius, with its ruler Saturn also, represents the oppositions to power and revolution. Saturn was the original revolutionary. Saturn went into Aquarius in 1991, just before the Rodney King beating in March of that year. The LA riots then began in 1992, just after the offending officers were acquitted of the beating. There was the Ruby Ridge incident, where the FBI learned that a former Green Beret had been stockpiling weapons and went to go investigate, which then resulted in loads of violence. This event became a big catalyst for the rise of the militia movement that would happen when Saturn went into Pisces. Some other interesting events that took place while Saturn was in Aquarius. In 1934, Adolf Hitler took power in Germany. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. led a march on Washington for civil rights in 1963. What's quite interesting is in the 1990s, 1992 to be exact, there was a devastating railroad strike that just lasted several days. Fast forward to Saturn being in Aquarius again in 2022, and we just had, well, almost had, a big railroad strike too that could have been quite devastating. In the first instance, the government broke it up. In this instance, once again, the government broke it up. The stereotypical Saturn and Aquarius type events would be the George Floyd protests, but also January 6th. You see sort of different expressions of this same sort of energy. But there are two opposing sides that are very discontented. So now I want to look at some events that correlate with Saturn and Pisces. We're going to be focusing particularly on the 1930s, the 1960s, the 1990s, and then of course leading up to the 2020s. A major theme of Saturn and Pisces is a clash of ideologies. It's almost as if there's a push to move into the future, but at the same time, there's this pull from the past. Reactionary forces, if you will, that want to go back to some fantasy that never really existed. Well, at the same time, others want to look ahead to a vision, right? Pisces is both fantasy and vision. They're two sides of the same coin. It just depends on the motive and where you're looking. In the United States, Pisces is the fourth house of home, of family, of legacy, of genealogy, of history. You can see patriotism. You can see nationalism. And as Saturn tours through that house, he amplifies those feelings, especially in response to the events that happen while Saturn toured Aquarius. For example, Ruby Ridge and Waco, Texas, were two of the biggest events that acted as catalysts to funnel people into the right-wing militia movement. It reached its height while Saturn was in Pisces in 1995. We'll see fanaticism and nationalism start to increase, again based on fantasies and based on misunderstandings of one's understanding of history. We do see some horrible events correlate with Saturn touring through Pisces. Like I said, the height of the militia movement was in 1995. What also happened in 1995 was the Oklahoma City bombing, perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh, who was a right-wing extremist, inspired by a book called The Turner Diaries, which sort of outlined a white supremacist view of the future. Speaking of fanaticism, there were 3 major violent attacks on abortion clinics while Saturn was in Pisces. 4 out of the 11 total abortion care providers killed in American history have happened while Saturn was in Pisces. There's something interesting about that, about fanatical motives leading to violence. You see, Saturn and Pisces can also bring about a messianic complex, sort of like I am the savior. And we saw rhetoric like this in the 1990s, the rise of the anti-abortion movement. According to the ADL, the Jewish Anti-Defamation League, right-wing terrorist incidents peaked in the United States in 1995. However, even though there is terrible deception, terrible illusion, and terrible oppositions, and even sometimes terrible violence, there's also hope that pierces through the veil of Saturn and Pisces. And that's part of the symbolism here, is you have to get through the fog. For example, in the 1990s, after a slew of mass shootings, the assault weapons ban of 1994 was passed. Now, it expired in 2004, but while it was around, it was landmark legislation. Once again, in 2023, we're talking about banning assault weapons once again. In fact, there's been a bill introduced in Congress about an assault weapons ban for 2023 and 2024. The themes in the 1960s largely had to do with the U.S.'s gruesome past with slavery and racism, and its legacy. Very fourth house where we had showdowns between civil rights forces and established power while Saturn toured Aquarius. While Saturn went into Pisces, we had a big backlash. One example were the marches on Selma. A group of civil rights activists went to go demonstrate in Selma, Alabama. Once they arrived, they were beset with police officers and a local posse, who then proceeded to beat them severely. The incident would later be referred to as Bloody Sunday. This was in 1965. Before that, in 1964, we did get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Following Bloody Sunday, we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, how about the 1930s? So as I said before, Hitler took power in 1934, just as Saturn was getting to the end of Aquarius. As Saturn passed into Pisces, Hitler announced that he was rearming Germany, and also passed the Nuremberg Laws, which essentially took away rights from Jews and minorities. In 1936, the German parliament passed a referendum that said only Nazi party officials could be represented in parliament. More on the hope side of things, 1936 was also the year of the Berlin Summer Olympics. Of course, Hitler was making a big deal of his nationalistic ideology. So it was quite fitting when Jesse Owens, a black man from America, took home 4 gold medals. As we know, the United States had its own terrible past with racism and nationalism. Also, while Saturn was in Pisces, we had the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which was a series of devastating dust storms, so bad that it forced people from their homes, millions, from Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, Texas. Many lost their lives from famine, and many others moved to California, which became the setting of many of the John Steinbeck novels you may be familiar with, like East of Eden or The Grapes of Wrath. Another hopeful thing that happened while Saturn was in Pisces was part of the New Deal. It was called the Work Projects Administration, or the WPA. We probably know that the Great Depression was terribly devastating, and unemployment reached as high as 25%. So the WPA put millions of people back to work, not only lifting material conditions for millions of Americans, but also their spirits. Something else quite interesting about Saturn and Pisces during the 1930s was Alcoholics Anonymous being founded. To me, Alcoholics Anonymous is so fitting of Saturn and Pisces because it's forcing us to face hard truths and healing through our trauma. So Saturn, on the one hand, has been known as the Lord of Deception, but he's also the Lord of hard work and discipline. He teaches us by threshing us. And Pisces is also a sign of illusion and fantasy. We oftentimes associate drugs and alcohol with Pisces. And it's so fitting to me that we have the disciplinarian wading through the sign of fantasy and escape to face difficult truths and to come to terms with reality. A few more hopeful words about Saturn and Pisces. During the 1990s, we saw a huge surge of interest in sustainability, recycling, and environmentalism. Climate change and global warming were entering the consciousness of the masses, and the urgency was becoming apparent. So as part of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we may or may not have opinions on, was also the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation of 1994. This was a signed agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico that they would adhere to certain environmental regulations and standards. In 1992, 154 countries in the United Nations signed an agreement about climate change. They essentially made a pledge to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. And this agreement went into effect while Saturn was in Pisces, March of 1994. The UK even passed the Environment Act of 1995. We saw similar acts that very same year in Bangladesh and Tasmania. So as I said, with Saturn in Pisces, we tend to see this theme of a clash of ideologies. In the 1930s, we saw a clash between fascism and democracy. We also had to face some hard truths about capitalism, which is why the New Deal came in. In the 1960s, we saw the clash between the civil rights movement and racism and white supremacy. We had to face hard truths about racism as part of America's legacy. In the 1990s, we started to see the clash, once again, between reactionary and progressive values. And we had to face hard truths about racism once again and extremism as being part of our heritage. Once again, in the 2020s, we can see that clash between regressive or reactionary values and more progressive or inclusive values. We see this tendency towards separation and this need sometimes for a messianic complex, the savior thing, as I talked about before. There often becomes this obsession with purity, with cleaning things, with cleansing. And it's a misunderstanding because you can't cleanse or sanitize life. Life is inclusive. In fact, it includes everything. All the myriad differences in existence are interdependent and interconnected, and therefore rely on each other for their existence. The evil side of Saturn in Pisces is the myth that we can cleanse ourselves in the world of the darkness, while the hopeful side of Saturn going through Pisces is about learning to see our patterns, learning to see our trauma and face it so that we can process it, atone for things if we've wronged someone, and to forgive and let go if someone has wronged us. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. We've seen a lot of horrors happen while Saturn has been in Pisces, and also a lot of wonderful, hopeful things that have given us a vision for how the future could unfold. Pisces has the capacity to hold out a vision for us, to inspire us. For as St. Paul said, where there is no vision, the people perish. I hope that was a little fun and informative for you, and perhaps a bit interesting. Please like the video, and please click the bell to subscribe. And once again, visit me at frankielynch.com because I do wonderful readings. And you can email me at frankielynch777@gmail.com. I love you. You're beautiful, and have a wonderful whatever you're having.